Hi everyone, I hope you're well. My name is Luke, I'm an interviewer and producer at How to Academy, and I've always wondered how junk food companies wheedle their way into the public discourse, how they use tactics to control economies and developing markets. And I had the pleasure and the fortune of chatting to Eduardo J. Gómez, who's the professor of community and population health at Lehigh University and the director of the Institute of Health Policy and Politics. And he's just written a book, handily, The Junk Food Politics: How Beverage and Fast Food Industries Are Reshaping Emerging Economies. And so I chatted to him all about this stuff. And yeah, I hope you enjoy.
Ed, hi, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good, thank you. Pretty good. Really enjoyed your book. Um, I want to start pretty simple, and then we'll go from there. And it might seem like an obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Junk food is bad for you, right? There was all this propaganda a while ago about the person who just ate McDonald's and was fine, and all of that, and the healthy eating pushes that a lot of these junk food companies are doing. But it is a problem, and big organizations have acknowledged it as a problem, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it really is a problem. I mean, junk food, as I define, is ultra processed foods, beverages with a high level of sugar, sodas. All these are not good for your health for many reasons, and have been associated with health challenges like overweight, obesity, type 2 diabetes. And so it's been widely acknowledged as posing a challenge to the body, and a lot of the ultra processed foods, not being nutritiously sound and providing the proper nutrients and contributing to our overweight and our sugar levels. So yes, I don't think it's a healthy option.
And I mean, you also quote the WHO, who also admitted that it was a problem, right?
Oh, yes. The WHO has been writing about this for a long time. It's been sort of leading the global acknowledgement of the challenge of obesity. It has, as I mentioned in the book, taken a firm stance, saying that we need to implement policies and address this issue of obesity and diabetes around the world, and we need to, implement policies to address this issue. And so the WHO has been doing a fantastic job on acknowledging sort of the harms and challenges of of foods that are contributing to our health ailments.
Hmm. And another very basic question, but again, I think is important, is who are the big players when we talk about these big companies? Who are the people who we should have in mind? Who are the sort of the brands that are really doing the the big hitting?
Well, I mean, the major, obviously, the major corporations that own bottling soda companies, ultra processed food, fast food chains. These are all the major players, are sort of the ones as I mentioned in my book, the ones that are really we need to be careful about. In my book, I mentioned Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Mondelez International, Kentucky Fried Chicken. All these establishments, are producing these foods, which we need. We especially the vulnerable communities I talk about in my book, children and the poor. These are the sounds we need to be careful about, and so it's important that also, we as I talk about in my book, the smaller stores. I talk about these smaller corner stores that sell a lot of these beverages and foods that are highly prevalent in rural areas, in a lot of these emerging economies. But those are some of the companies that I talk about in the book.
Hmm. And in that book, you focus on Mexico, Brazil, India, China, and Indonesia, which I thought was a really interesting and refreshing take. So two questions there. One, why simply did you focus on these countries? And two, can the quote unquote West or developing countries or whatever you'd like to call it, can they learn anything from these countries, or can they just go, oh well, it's just happening over there, we're fine, you know? So there's two questions.
Yes, absolutely. So I chose these countries because they are emerging middle income countries, that are seeing high growth, economic growth in the past 20 to 30 years. but at the same time have ongoing malnutrition. They have two problems. They have overnutrition, overabundance of consumption, leading to overweight, obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease. But then they have undernutrition, and they have a large segment of the population that still do not get adequate nutritious foods. That was one reason, and also because they have an emerging middle income class with that, and also anti-poverty programs that are providing funds for low income communities that can purchase these foods that are readily accessible and cheap. Um, and also, I chose these countries because I wanted global representation of the different regions: Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And unfortunately, I couldn't address all the countries around the world, obviously, and there were some countries I wish I could have talked more about. But I wanted to have global representation. And I do think that the US can learn from these countries in many ways because we face similar challenges in the US. We have over and undernutrition. We have a lot of areas that are food deserts, where a lot of individuals don't have access to healthy, nutritious foods for various socioeconomic and geographic reasons, much like in India or Brazil, where we have a lot of population that are in very hard to reach areas. You have these foods that are becoming available, and it's the same in the US. And so, how does the US learn from Brazil, India, or other countries, and trying to improve access to foods? And that's something that I don't talk about in my book, but I do talk about, what was important is that the US, like these countries that I talk about, mainly, for example, China, India, the US doesn't have any like these countries, they don't have any federal regulations on advertising and sales and marketing. Now, I talk about Mexico is starting to address this, and these are things that the US can learn from. Other countries that I don't talk about, like Chile, for example, or is a country where the US can learn a lot about on marketing, advertising, sales, and introducing regulations that do that. Well, as the countries that I talked about in my book were not the best examples of success stories. Mainly, the book is unfortunately is not about really success stories. It's about the ongoing challenges of trying to introduce regulation. So there weren't any cases where I think were excellent for the US to learn from, but there are other countries that I'm now doing research on, like Chile, for example, that are, and now more recently in Mexico, that are starting to introduce policies that the US and other advanced industrialized nations can learn from. What I find interesting about these emerging economies, and low and middle income countries, if you look at the data, for example, on soda taxes, these are countries that are it's mainly coming from, as the WHO and I think the World Bank has pointed out, these are mainly countries where these soda taxes are coming from. If you, there's a wonderful data set that I forget where I saw recently. Forget where it was, but this shows that that most of the soda taxes are coming from low and middle income countries. And so that's really interesting. Why is it that we're not seeing that at the national level in the US and other industrialized nations? But so I do think that there is an opportunity to learn from other countries, and the US, should really try to do that,
Mm.
and going forward, because we're seeing a lot of, some countries, not necessarily in the books that I talked to, not as much, but other countries are seeing some success on introducing policies to try to address this issue.
Absolutely, and I think certainly, I mean, from the UK and Europe, to a certain extent, the US, you talk about how the middle class is sort of shifting in a global sense towards China and India in sort of a proportion, but we are seeing, increased precarity in the West and in America, and as you say, food deserts are a thing, and people who are going to food banks, people who are really struggling to eat in Europe as well. So it's definitely not just over there, in a very important way. Um, so let's move into some of the tactics that junk food companies use, which I thought was the most scary and interesting part of your work. I think central to that is this idea of the two-way street, right? So before we go into specifics, could you just talk about why we should have two-way street as an image in our heads, and what is that, and why does it matter?
Yes, I think that it's important. First of all, the two-way street is where we often blame industries. And there's been a lot of literature that points the finger to major corporations, from tobacco to food to soda, and their lobbying and their pressures on government and their various tactics to alter policies. And this is nothing new. The commercial determinants of health have talked about this for many years. But on the other hand, we have to realize that governments are also reaching out to industries. And so we can't assign all the blame to industries. Governments are also acting in a way that facilitates industry's influence. And what I talk about is, for example, working, partnering with industries to introduce anti-poverty programs, anti-hunger programs, achieving social welfare objectives, achieving economic objectives that political leaders are trying to achieve. Of course, all these leaders in these high growth emerging economies, their goal is to provide jobs and employment opportunity for their citizens. But they're partnering with those industries that are contributing to these health issues, right? And so even though you won't have politicians that go in public saying, I'm working with so and so, they are, they are seen visibly opening plants or engage working with, or taking pictures with them, and sort of. But at sometimes they are, reaching out to these companies to invite them to invest in their countries. And so not only these companies, but also other types of industries that are multinational industries that will contribute to their growth. So that's what I mean by the two-way street. And I talk about how partnering with these industries is problematic, because while some of the endeavors are noteworthy, we all want to reduce poverty and improve access to food. Um, it's noteworthy, but at the same time, it's providing legitimacy to these industries, and it's giving the public image that these are good partners. And that's where it becomes very dangerous, because people and citizens are seeing that, and so that and also it becomes dangerous because governments don't have incentives to regulate. If these major corporations are partnering with you on on these social welfare initiatives, then the governments see them as a partner and don't see the need to regulate them. And so that's, and this is really a challenge. So that's what I meant by the two-way street, is we need to
Mhm.
see why government is allowing this to happen. And it's not only industry but government as well that's a problem oftentimes.
Definitely, it's a savage metaphor for the state that we're in, which is that often these countries seemingly choose between starvation and obesity, and there's a sort of a brutal thing there. But I think Peter Gelderloos talks brilliantly about the fact that as governments move away from move towards big companies, junk food companies, etc., they move away from the local and actually start to lose track of potentially smaller cooperatives or smaller trade networks that could facilitate school food programs or poverty reduction. And so it is a political choice, and there are other things these countries can do, right?
Absolutely. I mean, Brazil has done in the past wonderful work working with schools, working with local farmers and supplying healthy school meals. And there are a lot of options that can be pursued. We can't forget about, the traditional foods and the farmers and the whole foods that are often part of these countries' culinary traditions. And so, and so we have to encourage governments around the world and even in the US to tap into those healthier culinary traditions, and instead of trying to, partner with or have access to foods that are ultra processed and cheaper and packaged and prepackaged. And so that you're absolutely right. We can't forget about these smaller, healthier establishments, and trying to revive those healthier establishments and connect them with schools. In my book, I focus, a lot on children and vulnerable communities and schools. And so I think that's an ongoing challenge in the US and these other countries.
100%. Another thing, I mean, you mentioned there the variety of countries, but it really staggered me that you have, rarely do you see Modi, Nelson Mandela, and Lula in the same sentence, but they're all doing it across this political spectrum. It's a popular move.
Yeah, it is. It is. I mean, all these leaders They want to provide employment, they want to address poverty, they want to do all these wonderful things, and that's certainly admirable, but they have to be careful with who they're partnering with. That's the issue. And what that means and what are the consequences for that. And so and these are emerging high growth economies, as I mentioned earlier, that have is struggling to strive economically and develop, but at the same time, how do they deal with ongoing poverty and hunger? And so that's the challenge. And that's that you're right. And it's not only these leaders, other leaders around the world. I mean, I haven't really gone into, all the other countries that we're seeing this happen. And even in the US, the Obama administration partnered with Walmart, for example, right? In the Let's Move initiative. And so, the big corporations partner with the most progressive democratic liberal governments as well. So in the US, and so it's a global phenomenon.
100%. So going back to the tactics, you mentioned, campaign contributions, lobbying, industry partnerships, etc. There's two that I'm really curious to dig into. The first is literally setting up federal organizations to facilitate the partnership, and you mentioned that Brazil set up an whole agency to deepen that policy partnership. But it also happens when it comes to sort of infiltration you talk about in China. Could you just give a sort of infiltration and that infrastructural issues?
Absolutely. So infiltration is there's the political science literature, and yes, I discussed sort of the political science literature that talks about this and sociological literature. And this occurs when external ideas and interests find their way into within state institutions, and in the process, influence and create incentives and shape policy towards these external interests. It can be both private, but also it can be good, public. We saw with HIV/AIDS, we saw social movements in Brazil infiltrating the national government with ideas about providing drugs for antiretroviral medications for everyone. But it also can be negative. Private industries finding their ways within ministries of health to shape childhood obesity programs. So I discussed the case of China. I did mention the wonderful work by Susan Granghold at Harvard, who did this fantastic field work and research showing how the International Life Sciences Institute, which was established by the Coca-Cola Foundation, found like-minded individuals within the Ministry of Health in China, and how that facilitated the Coca-Cola and other soda ideas interests in trying to emphasize exercise and the importance of exercise over as a priority to address childhood obesity. And that is the regular approach by these companies, is that it's not really the calories, but the lack of physical activity. And by easily infiltrating the Ministry of Health in China, it was able to shape this national legislation in China, which was the first that I know of that that established federal regulations mandating that children exercise every morning in schools. And I remember doing the research and finding articles in China in Xinhua that were translated discussing how parents were so upset that their children had to run every morning, and how tiring it was for their students and how tired they were. But it was an example of a federal mandate for all schools. And that would never happen in the US. We're in a federal system where the states pretty much establish all policies on curriculum for schools. But that was one. And then in the case of Brazil, again, the Lula office creating an office that would facilitate partnerships with industries in order to address or support the Zero Fome, the anti-hunger campaign. And also in Brazil, industries finding presence within national agencies, the Anvisa, which is the regulatory agency, and how they were able through Eastleigh, but although by also ensuring that academics that had favorable interests and views were present in these agencies. And so these infiltration tactics is something that we really need to be careful about, because of course, when governments want to implement policies, they want to make sure they have all stakeholders present. They want to have civil society, the nutrition activists, they want to have industry, they want to have government, all of them talking about regulations. The problem is that who has more representation and who has more access? And it's these food industries, not necessarily with their direct presence, but indirectly through, Eastleigh or through academics that they are supportive or NGOs that are supportive, they find themselves. And so when you look at these entities, private interests are often have been more present in these institutions than nutrition activists and people wanting to do well. And so this is a very important tactic that has been that we really need to pay attention to. It's a very clandestine and very sneaky way of getting in there and creating ideas. So what is the next step? Is that governments need to make sure that there's equal representation. I would suggest, that the governments do not, allow for these kind of private interests involved, and so I think that that's really something that needs to be addressed, and it's a challenge. It's a major challenge, and hopefully that will be addressed in the future. But these are tactics that myself and others have talked about, and what I really think is important, we need to take examples from other public health threats like HIV/AIDS. For example, is a great way to learn about how public interest can infiltrate and how activist interest can infiltrate and overtake private interests when we need to address this public health emergencies.
I think there's something that you mentioned at the end there, which is that we need to look broader. There's a moment in the book where you say, they don't actually need to change minds; they just need to muddy the waters, right? They just need to prevent a unified voice on harsher regulation, and slow down the process. That struck me very similarly to oil companies and to the sort of the green issues that I think a lot of countries are facing right now, and specifically, I don't know if you're aware of Thomas Midgley, the inventor of incredibly both leaded petrol and CFCs. It was one person, but he used to do this. He would do crazy publicity stunts. So he'd wash his hands in leaded petrol and go, "See, it's fine," or he'd inhale CFCs and go, "It's the press would lap it up." And I do think that when you talk about infiltration, when you talk about academic infiltration as well, it's just muddying the waters. It's just the slight tapping of the scales that's even scarier, I think, in a grand scale. Do you ever see any comparisons there with fossil fuel companies and junk food companies?
I didn't do that comparison. I think that the biggest comparisons have been made with the tobacco industry. The
Right.
commercial determinants of health literature, which is the commercial determinants of health, is a very new topic, public health, that's probably emerged in the past 20 to 30 years. And it mainly stemmed from the concern with big tobacco and its impact. And so most of the examples come from big tobacco, big food. We haven't seen any, I haven't seen, of course, I don't know all the literature, but I haven't seen any comparisons with the oil sector. Another sector that needs to be looked at is gambling, gambling addiction. And I think the UK has a major issue with this, and other countries. But it's a tactic that was used by big tobacco in sort of, like you said, trying to question, delay and question the data and all these different things. And of course, with the WHO's, the regulations that they established, FCTC regulations. I mean, that was a very positive step in discouraging conflict of interest and not allowing for this kind of influence. And we haven't seen anything like that in the food and beverage sector. So the WHO can take a major leadership role in addressing these issues. But I think it's important that we try to establish connections with the oil sector, with the pharmaceutical sector, with the gambling sector, and do comparisons between these sectors and big food. But like you said, it is a process to delay and question, and that's what industries want to do. They want to delay and question, and question the significance, question to what extent does a soda tax really matter? Is it really going to change? Is it just because the soda is now a little bit more expensive, is that going to matter? So all these different questions is what industry activists always ask. And so that was a big challenge with the soda tax, and like the tobacco tax, that was always, these taxes are always questioned. What I find very interesting, though, is that you have, as I mentioned in the book, a paradox. You have all these countries doing these great things on taxes, on awareness, but when it comes to regulation, that's a line that governments do not want to cross because that is a direct threat to industry's marketing and sale. And one area that we really need to pay attention to is social media. Social media is one that we really have nothing available on. And now most people are going on apps. Most people are going on their TikToks, their Instagram, a lot of apps to get information, and that's where a lot of these advertisements are. So, but I agree with you. Muddling the waters, slowing the waters through these activities is all part of a industry plan.
It's very pernicious, and something I want to pull up on, which is that you mentioned the WHO a few times, and it is not the most popular in the sort of the public discourse. It's not the most popular world body, shall we say. It took a lot of flack during COVID. And something that is discussed is how public health officials and how bureaucrats communicate to people. And a surprising thing that I learned in your work is that junk food companies are really good at sending a boat down the river in the Amazon to communicate to, like, basically completely remote communities and go, here's some Coke, Coca-Cola, not cocaine, but that's something that potentially public health organizations like the WHO, like the UN, could learn from. No.
Absolutely. Reaching out to the most remote areas, both the WHO, the governments, working with the WHO, reaching the most hard to reach areas, and in providing these visitations to provide information. You see, the WHO, the way it's structured, it's a decentralized organizational structure. So you have the major body in Geneva, then you have the regional offices, right? And so it's not a unified organization, and so it cannot delegate and cannot mandate what other regions do. As far as I know, I may be wrong, but I believe that's how it works. And so it makes it very challenging to, and of course you have staffing issues, you have money issues. Every public entity in the United Nations will rely on the contributions of member states, and if that's not sufficient to meet these needs, then that doesn't happen. In contrast, these major corporations have all the money they need to go into the most remote areas and provide them these things. So I think that it's a very good idea is public WHO and government reach and sending people and teams of people to the most remote areas to provide them information and let them know what they're doing and suggest alternatives and work with local farmers or work with local producers of foods that are healthier as healthier options. And so, but that's a good point. I mean, something I hadn't really thought about much is we know a lot about the private sector's reach in providing these floating food, but to what extent are public entities doing the same kind of outreach initiatives? Uh, and I think it's a lot of resource issues. That
Mm.
would be very expensive, and it's something that should have more support for in the future.
Yeah, yeah. It's something also, talking about the ways that the junk food companies try to shift the direction of discourse. They make lots of pledges. There's lots of pledges in your book, and lots of, they will raise awareness, or they'll promote certain things, or they'll communicate, etc. Those things. I mean, there was a big push in the UK to put calories on everything, which at first sounds good until you realise that all the junk food companies vetoed more obvious communication, like spoonfuls of sugar, which would have been more obvious, and then secondly that there was no follow up, and there are lots of eating disorder charities that are now saying that this is doing a huge amount of harm to people if it's completely, it's smacked onto everything, and there's the dark red, and especially with issues like obesity, where we know now that social shaming just makes things worse, and that certain words, certain discourse, certain discussions makes the problem worse, and it's such a difficult one to communicate and to get right, right?
Oh yes, absolutely. No, you're absolutely. That's a very good point.
Yeah. So the thing that's also really scary here is how much they market to children. Um, Now, obviously, fast food ads are, the Happy Meal is a classic example, which there's always a certain level of marketing to children, but that is something that I think can be very quickly advocated against, and I think most people wouldn't support. junk food. Just talk to me a little bit about how extensive that children marketing is.
Yeah, oh, that's very extensive, and it's very sad. Something that's been getting a lot of attention, and countries have been recognizing that. Mexico, for example, introduced regulations on limiting the marketing or advertisement of foods during certain hours of the week. Other countries have acknowledged it. It really has been. Now, the countries I mentioned, with the exception of Mexico, really don't have any federal regulations that address this issue, much like the US. And this is an ongoing problem. But it's one that industries have been trying their best to address and sort of self-regulate. But the challenge is, again, there's no regulations on effective enforcement of regulations, or just no regulations. These countries also no regulations on social media apps. I just think that's the future of where children and adolescents, especially adolescents, are going and getting this information. And I think that is something that definitely needs to be taken more seriously. And it's very interesting that it hasn't been, because when we think about other major epidemics that affected children, polio, for example, government officials were so concerned and so worried, but when it comes to childhood obesity, we're not seeing the same kind of policy actions, or same kind of effort. And that's what's really puzzling. And it's really sad to see that. And so, yeah, I think that that's an ongoing challenge. I think that really needs to be enforced. And I think that I mentioned India, where they're making some steps in doing that. But again, there's no uniform enforcement of these policies. Some states do it, some states don't. That's a challenge of federalism. And so in Mexico recently, they've been having a law that was passed in where at the city level, local level, where they're trying to prohibit the sale of junk foods to minors. And so that has been a step forward. But these are very small examples of what needs to be done at a federal level, and to treat this very seriously. But it's not really, as I mentioned in my book, it's not something that's been taken very seriously. And I think that is critical for future success in addressing childhood obesity, but also adolescent diabetes. As I mentioned, that is where we're seeing the most type 2 diabetic, well, a lot of the type 2 recent diabetics emerging is from the adolescent ages. And so and I mentioned China and India, Mexico, as I think in the top 10 globally for this kind of challenge. Type 2 diabetes used to be something that was seen mainly among older populations, but now it's becoming almost a norm for adolescents, young people, to be getting diagnosed with pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, that's really scary. So, in the final part of this chat, we're going to go on to some actual practical stuff that maybe we can all work towards as a society. But before we do that, in the news recently, in the last couple of weeks, there's been the big aspartame scare, right? The fact that Diet Coke might be worse for you than regular Coke, and that all of the artificial sweeteners might be cancerous. Now, regardless of where the evidence is on that, it's all very conflicting. But as companies shift, as a sort of pressure on the West is shifting towards sugar alternatives, the underlying problem here is that they will always seek growth and profit, and they will always try and cut corners. Are you worried that in our hunt to hold these companies to account, that there may be other things that bubble up that are worse, like, for example, artificial sweeteners?
Well, I mean, I think that industries, like you said, are profit motivated, and they want to take advantage of changing nutritional knowledge in the US and awareness in the US and other countries. Globally, I think it's inevitable that more and more people will learn about the harms of high sugary products. So industries are going to evolve along with that knowledge, and they're going to introduce these other kinds of beverages that have these kinds of chemicals in them. And obviously that is a concern. I mean, I don't know exactly the science behind all that, but I certainly would be very concerned about new kind of products that what scientists are finding may be more harmful for you. But that's just a natural progression. I mean, I think that the latest, I think Diet Coke probably is the best seller in the US compared to regular Coke. I haven't looked at the latest data. Someone mentioned that to me recently, but I think that that's just a natural progression of how this is going to happen, is that industries will be meeting those kinds of these more dietary, low sugar needs. And we really need to be careful about what that alternative is and how that's potentially harming us. I always think that anything that's added that's not natural is gonna have some not good. It can't be good, right? It can't be good. Something that's produced in the industry that enters our body, can't be good. And so, yeah, I think you're right. I think that we need to be careful about this. But I also think, and I'm optimistic. I mean, I'm optimistic that we in society will learn more. And learn more about what we're eating and consuming, and have more and I think that as I mentioned in my book, and the fear that we as a society have, that in the West, or especially now, and that's why industries are going to these countries for the opportunity. But I think that this knowledge is going to spread globally over time, and I think that that's going to lead to new kinds of products that we need to be careful about.
So you mentioned something that you said society a bunch of times, and I think it's something that's in this very extensive and big book. You never once put the blame on the individual mother who's trying to feed her kids, or the kid who picks up the thing that's the shiniest and nicest. And you go after corporations, structural issues, governments, etc. And in the realm of health discourse and junk food discourse, that's not always the done thing. It's often quite easy to blame the individual. In fact, I had an interview with Anders Hansen, a popular scientist who was very fun to talk to, but he had a list of 10 wellness tips for happiness and for attention. And I sort of joked that maybe one of them should have been push for political change, or push for a bigger structural shift, which you definitely talk about. Could you just speak about the link there, or rather the sort of dismantling the complete individual blame from the wider structures?
Yes. This is an ongoing problem with a lot of what I call contested epidemics. Contested epidemics. I started my academic career talking about AIDS, obesity. Are you'll always have people that say it's individual responsibility and consequences versus it's a public responsibility, right? That's an ongoing problem and issue. And I believe that it's not an individual issue, because, individuals are often, especially vulnerable communities, children and the poor, are often in environments that make it extremely, extremely difficult for them to make sound choices, to have access to foods that are healthier. And so, this is the problem. And you have children that don't know the latest nutritional dietary knowledge, right? They don't understand and have a good understanding of this. And you have poor communities that are live in food deserts, right? Food deserts that do not provide these healthy options. And oftentimes poor individuals that work multiple jobs, that have a difficult time finding the time, single parent homes with parents working multiple jobs. And when you're surrounded by easily accessible, cheaper foods, it really makes it really difficult and to put the blame on the individual. And that's why we need a call for action for federal and policy efforts to address these issues at a structural level, political level. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, many public health nutrition activists have argued for this. And but again, industry's argument is it's individual choice and responsibility. It's individual choices, this is something that we really need to educate the consumer. We need to educate them on nutrition. We need to educate them on exercise. We need to encourage exercise and encourage responsibility on exercise. But we really need to address these other structural issues that I talk about. And and that's where the position that I take. But we'll always have these counter arguments. It's always out there. And so that's what it's really we need to pay attention to, is these other structural things that really individuals don't have control over oftentimes.
Completely. And just generally, I think something that really comes across in your work is these companies are not there to help you. They're there to make money, and that will almost always be over the backs of, as you say, poor people and young people and disabled people and all sorts.
Well, industries do help people. They do, as what's called corporate social responsibility. They do a lot of wonderful things, but again, we know what the motive is, right? And that's what makes it challenging. I always get this question. It's corporate social responsibility. It's great that they are working to address poverty and nutrition and regulations and improving food safety, which is something that is really important, providing safe street food. We don't want people having food poisoning, right? On street foods, for example. But again, does that, again, it's often for other intentions, or it's a way to to become publicly visible, to be seen as a partner with government, to be seen as a good contributor to society. And of course we know that industries do want to make money, right? They want to have that kind of public legitimacy. So yeah, it's something that's a very challenging issue, something that, and then when you're a resource poor country and you cannot have the funds needed to introduce a lot of things, and industry approaches you and says we'd like to partner with you, it's hard for these governments to sort of say no.
Of course, it's sort of that short term versus long term, you know, pain and pleasure. The short term is that yes, this school gets a healthy eating program, but the long term is that they're basically indoctrinated into thinking that these companies are good for them, and then health problems go on down the line.
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
Well, it's not an easy problem, but your work and your book certainly goes a decent way to helping educate us and informing us about the nasty tactics and also the things that we can push for as a society. Ed, thank you so much for your conversation. It was completely fascinating.
Yes, well, thank you for having me on your podcast, and I really appreciate the opportunity. And if anyone has any further questions, happy to address them. And thanks again.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.